All right, menopause. The end of fertility in women has long been associated with a bewildering array of symptoms. Hot flashes, memory loss, nervousness, vaginal dryness, night sweats, and inhibited sexual desire currently headline an ever-changing set of complaints. Throughout American history, most women have coped with their symptoms, should they occur, in a variety of ways: grinding their teeth, doting on grandchildren, drinking a shot or two of whiskey, buying a fan, running for political office. In other words, most women fought menopausal discomforts without calling on the ministrations of medicine. But in the last 100 years or so, physicians have increasingly courted menopausal women as patients. Menopausal women, in turn, have sought medical care. As a result, over the course of the 20th century, menopause has become medicalized. Now, feminists in the academy and out have decried this medicalization of menopause, claiming that physicians and drug companies have worked in tandem to transform menopause from a natural biological process into a pathological condition. Indeed, for many American women reaching menopause near the turn of the millennium, menopause has become associated with doctor's visits and prescription drugs in ways unforeseen by their grandmothers, or at least their great-grandmothers. So this increased medical involvement has assuredly relieved a variety of symptoms, but it has also exposed women to health risks, the extent of which remain unknown. Although menopause has undeniably come under increased medical scrutiny and intervention, the generalized critique of medicalization fails to adequately illuminate the process through which menopause became medicalized. By focusing on a medicalized endpoint, a slippery marker in its own right, some critical issues become obscured. For example, what drives medicalization? Does medicalization change over time? At what threshold do we consider something medicalized? Who benefits from medicalization? So this paper is not an attempt to pinpoint the precise moment when menopause ceased to be regarded as a natural transition and came to be understood as a pathological condition. Indeed, I'm not convinced that that transition has ever occurred, at least not completely. Neither is this talk an attempt to establish guidelines for determining whether something has become medicalized. Instead, this talk more modestly attempts to flesh out the historical involvement of medicine in the medical construction, the popular understanding, and the lived experience of menopause in the United States. It explores what medicalization looked like at any given moment and how medicine changed the experience and the meaning of menopause. So this is where I'm going with this talk. So I'm going to be talking about sort of the involvement of menopause and medicine in 4 different periods. So we'll come back to these themes as we go along, but we're going to start out at the very end of the 19th century when the first book on menopause was published, and we're going to end in 2000, and at the turn of the century. I gesture to something that happens in 2002, but I don't talk about it. So this is the roadmap for where we're going. So let it start out in 1897. Physicians notice menopause. Now, before the end of the 19th century, American physicians paid scant attention to menopause, except to note, with no small degree of foreboding, that it was serious business. To the extent that it was discussed, menopause was described as a critical period, a biological Rubicon that tested a woman's emotional and physical fortitude. Despite the potential significance of menopause, however, physicians in the United States seemed largely unconcerned. Few American journal articles focused on menopause, and no American doctor published a monograph on menopause until 1897. So 1897 is the first book on menopause published in the United States. By the late 1890s, however, physicians began to take menopause more seriously as a worthy object of study. In addition to starring in medical and journal articles, menopause began to appear regularly in national and local medical journals. To be sure, this trickle of medical attention was far from a torrent. Indeed, a common theme in the late 19th and early 20th centuries bemoaned the continuing neglect of menopause. Paradoxically, when menopause began to attract medical attention, it seemed robbed of its medical significance. So by the end of the 19th century, menopause was no longer talked about as a Rubicon. Instead, the medical literature described it as an important milestone in a woman's life, but denied that it was fraught with danger. So most physicians in the early 20th century encouraged menopausal women to seek medical attention, but they explicitly denied that women needed medical treatment at menopause. Instead, physicians believed that information and reassurance were more valuable than, quote, all the therapeutic agents under the sun. As late as 1935, eminent Johns Hopkins professor of gynecology Emil Novak, and we're going to hear from him again later, maintained that physicians, quote, earn their fees better through education and prevention than by writing out a prescription. Physicians generally believed that an explanation and a description of the physiological changes of menopause could alleviate most women's suffering. Physicians coupled reassurance with a prescription for healthy habits, urging their menopausal patients to get lots of sleep and daily exercise in the fresh air, a moderate diet, and avoidance of alcohol, loose-fitting clothes, all promised corsets. I mean, doctors said, get rid of your corset a lot. All these things promised to diminish the discomforts that emerged at middle-aged. Now, notably, this prescription differed little from the regimen encouraged for all people at middle age, regardless of sex or complaint. Why do I have a picture of a sheep? Unlike physicians in the 19th century, however, doctors during this period had a new therapeutic tool to help ease a woman's journey through menopause, organotherapy, also referred to as ovarian therapy. Now, the therapeutic promise of organotherapy was revealed in 1889 when a French-born physiologist, Charles Edward Brown-Séquard, injected himself with extracts from guinea pig and dog testes. He reported renewed vigor as a consequence. The first use of ovarian therapy for gynecological disturbances occurred in Berlin in 1898 when fresh cow ovaries were fed to a young woman who had had her ovaries removed and was suffering from severe hot flashes. By 1910, researchers in the United States had begun using ovarian preparations to, quote, combat the insufficiency or absence of the ovarian function at the time of menopause. Now, I have a sheep here and not a cow because by the 1920s, desiccated sheep ovary was probably the way most women, to the extent that they got hormones at all, got some kind of replacement therapy. But also, by 1920, at least 3 pharmaceutical companies manufactured some kind of ovarian extract. We don't know what they're giving them yet, right? We haven't isolated estrogen and progesterone in the 1920s, although we have by this moment. So they're giving essentially what they find in the ovaries, they're giving to women. Despite the alleged promise of organotherapy, most physicians remained skeptical about its worth through the 1930s, even after estrogen and progesterone were isolated from these ovarian extracts, claiming that ovarian therapy was crude, largely ineffective, and expensive. Even proponents of ovarian therapy conceded that most women did not need any pharmaceutical intervention. For example, in 1922, Emil Novak argued that ovarian therapy could help relieve the vasomotor symptoms, that is, particularly the hot flashes, but later he insisted that most women need no treatment at all. After the 1929 isolation of estrogen, ovarian therapy, which we can now legitimately call hormonal therapy, became more refined and presumably more effective at easing at least some of the symptoms of menopause. Consequently, physicians began to shed their earlier skepticism about its value. However, acceptance, however, was neither immediate nor complete. Instead, through the 1930s, hormone replacement therapy attracted a great deal of attention, but relatively few converts. American physicians between 1897 and 1940 then began expressing increased interest in understanding menopause and their menopausal patients. In this sense, menopause was medicalized during this period. It's come under greater medical scrutiny and medical control. But this increased interest by physicians, however, does not in itself demonstrate the medical takeover of menopause. Indeed, medical consensus during the period neither defined menopause as a medical problem nor claimed that menopause required the ministrations of medicine. Even the potential value of ovarian therapy failed to convince most physicians that menopause warranted medical intervention. For their part, women seem to have agreed. Although some women surely felt discomfort at menopause, most of them failed to take hormones, to take these discomforts to physicians for relief. Perhaps loosening a corset, a swig of Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound. There are Doan's pills that you can get for menopause during this period, lots of patent medicines. Or perhaps participation in a suffrage parade. I mean, because physicians all the time tell women, find something useful to do. And really, suffrage becomes one of the things that menopausal women are apparently opponents of suffrage believed that the suffrage movement was filled with cranky menopausal women. And therefore, they could sort of be dismissed because they're sort of raging menopausics, as somebody called them. So, but you know, I'm sure it made some women feel better. So even when they did seek a physician's counsel, they more likely received information, and perhaps, frankly, a patronizing there, dear, than the newest pharmaceutical weapon. But before the 1940s, then, physicians remained largely on the sidelines of the menopausal experience. Medicine became more involved, however, in the wake of two biomedical developments. First, in 1938, Sir Charles Dodds developed a synthetic hormone, diethylstilbestrol. Maybe some of you have heard of it, called DES. Although DES eventually gained notoriety for its use as a morning sickness preventative, it was first prescribed for menopausal women in 1941. Second, in 1943, James Goodall developed an estrogen extract from the urine of pregnant mares. So you can see so DES was a synthetic estrogen. This is a natural estrogen, comes from pregnant mares. This product, known as conjugated estrogen, most famously as Premarin. Now, Premarin is still a big drug for hormone replacement therapy, and Premarin comes from pregnant mare's urine, which is just one of these medical history facts I enjoy. So there you go. So, and Premarin, in some ways, potentially changes things. So Premarin had all the good effects, all the benefits of DES without any of its potential side effects. DES was apparently pretty difficult to tolerate, unlike Premarin. Now, taking together these developments, they indicate an important shift in the possible therapeutic regimen for menopause. But to what extent did the introduction of DES and Premarin medicalize menopause? What happens if I do this? Nope, not yet. All right. So many elite, first I'm going to talk about medical reluctance, actually. So that you've got these new developments, but there's a lot of medical reluctance. So many elite physicians realized that these new forms of estrogen, being readily available, cheap, and efficacious, represented a watershed in the possible medical treatment of menopause. Rather than recommending their widespread use, however, physicians writing in the medical literature generally regarded hormones as a useful treatment for occasional cases. Indeed, physicians recommended a three-tiered treatment plan. First, they insisted that most menopausal symptoms could still best be treated with reassurance and education. These physicians urged their colleagues to explain the physiology of menopause, to discuss what women might experience, and to emphasize that symptoms would eventually subside on their own. Really, in 7 or 8 years, you'll feel better. Physicians believed that once women were armed with knowledge, even the hot flashes would, quote, diminish in importance and cease to be troublesome. If you know what's going on, you won't be bothered. Despite their confidence in a reassuring word and a sympathetic ear to solve most women's menopausal difficulties, these physicians acknowledged that some women needed more than a heart-to-heart talk and a lesson in physiology. For women who needed something extra, many physicians recommended the short-term use of mild sedatives, typically 15 milligrams of phenobarbital 3 times daily. And this is an advertisement for maybe not phenobarbital, but some kind of barbiturate. Aware of the addictive potential of barbiturates, most physicians recommended sedation only as a short-term treatment to temporarily ease the anxiety and nervousness many women experienced. In theory, sedatives helped women adjust to their new social circumstances or cope with their family crises. And then, only if reassurance and sedation failed, did most physicians recommend hormone treatments for menopause. Let me come back to Premarin here. Most doctors writing in the medical literature reserved hormonal therapy for women with severe, unrelenting symptoms. Physicians typically claimed that only 5 to 10% of women seeking medical attention at menopause met the criteria for hormone therapy. Most physicians agreed with Emil Novak, who claimed that in general, it seems better to let nature take its course, except in those cases and at those times when symptoms become very troublesome. And sometimes they combined hormones and sedatives, as you can see in this advertisement for a Premarin Milltown combo. The fear of cancer prompted the cautious approach of some physicians. Now, at the same time this is going on, by 1940, more than a dozen scientific papers had been published showing that both synthetic and natural estrogens were capable of causing cancer in female animals, particularly mice, but not exclusively mice. Others voiced the fear of the carcinogenic effects of estrogenic compounds in the breast and uterus of women. So no evidence of that, but there was fear of that. The cancer threat became even more menacing in 1947 when Saul Guesberg linked estrogen to cancer of the endometrium, leading him to conclude that physicians overprescribed estrogens to postmenopausal women. So even in this era of medical reluctance, this guy is saying, I think you're overprescribing estrogen. Physicians differed sharply on the significance of the cancer threat. A very few physicians found the evidence of the link between estrogen and cancer so persuasive that they viewed the increased availability of estrogen as a potential danger to women. On the other end of the spectrum, some physicians dismissed the cancer threat entirely. And most physicians, as you might assume, stood somewhere in between, believing, quote, that although there is no proof that estrogenic substances are carcinogenic in themselves, there is evidence that carcinoma occurs more frequently in women with high estrogen levels. So there's a little concern, but we don't know what to do with it. So consequently, most physicians writing in the medical press during this time period advocated a conservative approach. Now, most physicians who did prescribe hormones and sedatives between 41 and 62 argued strongly that the treatment should be temporary, lasting just long enough to help women adjust to her diminished estrogen level. By the mid-1950s, however, a very few physicians began to promote indefinite use. Okay, so once you hit menopausal age, indefinite use of hormones. The work of Fuller Albright at Harvard Medical School probably sparked this approach. In a 1941 JAMA article, Albright claimed that the postmenopausal state was the most significant factor in osteoporosis, and that estrogen therapy helped bones retain calcium. By 1953, other researchers made similar claims about the ability of long-term estrogen therapy to reduce heart disease in postmenopausal women. So building on the allegedly illness-preventing benefits of estrogen replacement therapy, by the end of the 1950s, a handful of physicians started suggesting an aggressive interventionist role for replacement therapy. These physicians suggested that estrogen be given to all women at menopause to prevent the, quote, tragic consequences of estrogen deprivation. In 1954, for example, Kosh Shelton of UCLA claimed that menopause frequently transformed women, quote, into shells of their formerly alluring selves. He rejected the notion that because menopause was natural, that it should be allowed to run its debilitating course. Instead, he advocated estrogen substitution therapy to allow women to remain, quote, physiologically intact. We talk about dogs remaining intact, right? But physiologically intact throughout their lives. In the 1950s, Kost represented a notable exception to a more general conservative approach to estrogen therapy in the medical press. He also foreshadowed a development that emerges with more vigor in the 1960s, as we'll see. If we relied on the medical press, that is, what doctors are telling other doctors, if we relied on the medical press exclusively, however, to reveal the history of hormonal treatments for menopause in the 1940s and 50s, our picture would be significantly skewed. Indeed, it was during this period of medical conservatism that women routinely began to use estrogen therapy to ease their menopausal symptoms. Two surveys from the 1950s indicated that roughly 30 to 35% of the highly educated, middle-class white women surveyed in these surveys received hormone treatments. Incidentally, 29% of those same women reported receiving nerve pills. So both sedation and estrogen therapy is emerging with a vengeance in this period. So how can we reconcile the conservative path recommended in the medical press with the widespread use of hormones? Well, several factors contributed to prescription rates higher than those that might be predicted by the medical literature. First, the use of estrogens in this time period must be understood within a context of larger therapeutic revolution. The development of sulfa drugs, and I hear you're going to hear more about sulfa drugs in the spring in this lecture series, and penicillin in the 1930s and 1940s created a public demand for the so-called miracle drugs. As this happened, patients increasingly expected physicians to end a medical encounter by prescribing a drug. But that idea that physicians end a medical encounter with a prescription is new to the sort of the post-war period. Second, this drug revolution was coupled with aggressive marketing strategies by the drug industry. So the caption says, "You can't see any drug detail men because the waiting room is full, but doctor, we're all drug detail men," just showing how much of a fixture drug company representatives were in doctors' offices. So after World War II, drug companies began advertising their products in earnest to physicians, both through advertisements in medical journals and through detailing. Indeed, physicians in the 1950s were much more likely to learn about drug efficacy and advisability from a detail man than a medical journal. So while doctors and medical journals are saying, really, most women don't need hormones, detail men from the drug companies might have been telling physicians a quite different story. A physician faced with a suffering menopausal patient might eagerly provide a prescription for a drug recently promoted by a salesperson. And patient demand provides a third and related explanation for the widespread use of hormones during this period. Evidence suggests that women approach their doctors asking for hormone therapy. Indeed, physicians often expressed frustration at the unreasonable expectations women had for estrogens. So patient demand was undoubtedly stoked by the popular press, which enthusiastically touted the wonders of estrogen therapy. Magazines and popular books heralded hormone treatments as, quote, one of the most brilliant accomplishments of modern medicine. Claiming that the march of medical progress was nothing short of divine, a medical writer promoted the medical miracles brought on by hormone therapy. Other authors goaded their readers into seeking out hormone therapy, dismissing women's resistance as wrong-headed and old-fashioned. Sometimes, as this cartoon suggests, husbands also goaded their wives into seeking hormonal treatments. So I don't know, this is, "Oh, Henry, I forgot to get my hormones. Oh, for goodness sake, let's get them. Maybe you'll be nicer to me for a while." And this is actually a whole comic genre of suffering husbands suffering because of their menopausal wives. So we can see that husbands may have also been pushing this hormone treatment. Popular characterizations made it seem reasonable and progressive for women to seek medical relief at menopause. The modern woman should reject the plight of her grandmother, resist the role of martyr, and take control of her body and her health. Medical science made that control possible. Even when these authors claimed that most women would not need hormones, women with symptoms might have assumed that their situation required medical intervention. Significantly, however, the increased popularity of hormone therapy occurred without simultaneously viewing menopause itself as pathological. Indeed, many of the same physicians who embraced the judicious use of hormones simultaneously dismissed the notion that menopause represented any kind of pathology. As one physician declared in 1945, menopause is an integral part of the process of aging. It can in no sense be regarded as a disease. Making the point slightly differently, a few physicians distinguish between treating menopause and treating its symptoms. Elmer Severinghaus, a self-proclaimed pioneer in the hormonal treatment of menopausal symptoms, clearly recognized the subtle distinction. He insisted that, quote, the menopause does not require any therapy, but the menopausal syndrome may well be worth treating. In sum, the advent of estrogens like Premarin did change the treatment many women received in the 1940s and 1950s. Although physicians writing in the medical literature resisted hormones as a therapy of first resort, many doctors prescribed estrogens for their menopausal patients. The enthusiastic portrayal of hormones in the popular press explains, in part, patient demand. Drug marketing directed at physicians explains, in part, doctors' acquiescence. Coupled with the real discomfort of many menopausal women, these factors help explain the disconnect between the conservative medical model and the actual medical practice. So it is surely legitimate to claim that the process of medicalization was at work between 1941 and 1962. Paradoxically, however, medicalization apparently gained hold despite the intentions of the very physicians who published scholarly articles on menopause. Nevertheless, as stories heralding the medical promise of hormones appeared between the covers of Red Book and Reader's Digest, and detail men visited doctors to pitch the latest wonder drug, many middle-class women began to see hormones and sedatives as appropriate responses to the trials of menopause. Nevertheless, medicalization was far from absolute during this period. The limited evidence suggests that of the women most likely to seek medical care during this period, educated, upper-middle-class white women, no more than 30% of them used hormones. For women outside of this demographic, medical involvement was probably significantly less. As a result, for most women during this period, menopause remained a process untouched by medical intervention. And then things change. All right. In 1962, Johns Hopkins gynecologist Alan Barnes posed a question to the readers of Consultant, a sort of popular medical journal, not scholarly medical journal. The question was, is menopause a disease? He answered affirmatively, listing the consequences of estrogen deficiency and concluding, quote, menopause is a disease process requiring active intervention. Other physicians pledged their support for this idea. Francis Rose characterized menopause, quote, as a chronic and incapacitating deficiency disease, and insisted that it was, quote, both morally and medically justifiable, I love the morally justifiable, to provide long-term hormone treatment. The language of disease, so jarring in these articles, marks a new development in the medical involvement with menopause. Now, this disease model of menopause claimed that menopause could be accurately and fruitfully understood as estrogen deficiency disease. People actually, some physicians stopped talking about menopause altogether and only talk about estrogen deficiency disease. With this frame, menopause became comparable to conditions more commonly understood as diseases such as diabetes. Indeed, just as insulin deficiency disease produced diabetes, just as insulin deficiency produced diabetes, so too did estrogen deficiency produce menopause. In both cases, the cure was clear: provide the missing element. Now, it is tricky to date precisely the emergence of this general understanding of the menopausal transition. Surely, some physicians had recommended estrogen or its precursor to compensate for the natural depletion of hormones throughout the century. It could be argued then that the disease model emerged at the same time as hormonal therapy. But four new characterizations of menopause and its treatment came together only in the early 1960s. and suggest a significantly new understanding of menopause. First, the creation of estrogen deficiency disease blamed menopause for a wide range of conditions more commonly understood as consequences of aging. Wrinkles, osteoporosis, heart disease, depression, sexual dysfunction, dull hair, sagging breasts, hypertension, and alcoholism were all allegedly the tragic consequences of estrogen deficiency under this new disease model. Although physicians had previously linked increased rates of heart disease and osteoporosis to decreased postmenopausal estrogen levels, these earlier physicians had not indicted menopause itself as the censurable culprit. Second, the disease model often hinged on the claim that menopausal women, by outliving their reproductive potential, were themselves unnatural. Arguing, I kid you not, arguing that menopausal women were evolutionary accidents or products of modern medicine which had unnaturally extended the female lifespan, estrogen deficiency proponents legitimated aggressive medical intervention. Before the disease model took hold, menopause was touted by some physicians as evidence of evolutionary wisdom, not of accident, because it allowed women to raise rather than just bear their children. Third, the disease model proposed that replacement hormones should be given to women regardless of whether they exhibited symptoms, right? All women. The problem, according to this model, was not the hot flash or the dry vagina or nervous anxiety. The problem was estrogen deficiency. As a result, adherents to this construction argued that withholding hormones from women just because they complained of no discomfort flew in the face of responsible preventative medicine. Finally, the disease model often explicitly uses the language of disease, and that's a new part of this. Certainly, descriptions of menopause that referred to estrogen deprivation, which required medical treatment, suggest that earlier formations of the disease model did not necessarily depend on the language of disease. But nevertheless, the rising concern about the perils of estrogen deficiency generally coincided with the rhetorical application of the word disease. The doctors who promoted this model self-consciously indicated that their conception of menopause was both new and groundbreaking. The most famous proponent of the disease model of menopause was a Brooklyn gynecologist, Robert Wilson, who's just one of my favorite characters ever. Although he first published his controversial views in the medical press, and that's what this is. His first medical article was titled, "The Fate of the Non-Treated Postmenopausal Woman, a Plea for the Maintenance of Adequate Estrogen from Puberty to the Grave." And so the caption here, this is a woman who menopause, she saw that in the rearview mirror, right? So this woman is clearly not middle-aged, but we keep her on estrogen to the grave. But the caption says, "Woman showing some of the stigmata," which is such rich language, the stigmata, and I show you my palms, sorry about that, of nature's defeminization. The general stiffness of muscles and ligaments, the dowager's hump, the negativistic expressions are part of a picture usually attributed to age alone. Some of these women exhibit signs and symptoms similar to those of early stages of Parkinson's. They exist rather than live. And this is not popular press, this is in the medical press. You see why I love Robert Wilson. So he first published his controversial views in the medical press. He achieved fame of a sort by taking his message of despair and hope to the general public in a book entitled, 1966 book entitled Feminine Forever. the documented story of one of the modern medicine's most revolutionary developments and breakthrough, the realization that menopause is a hormone deficiency and totally preventable. Now, almost every woman, regardless of age, can safely live a full sex life for her entire life. So you can see what menopause then is really about. At least a lot in this period is about worrying about defeminization, worrying about a sex life. All right, so Feminine Forever and its medically oriented precursors detailed the consequences of nature's defeminization. Wilson claimed that estrogen depletion led to hypertension, high cholesterol, osteoporosis, and arthritis. In addition, he insisted that menopause frequently led to serious emotional disturbances. Even women who escaped debilitating depression frequently acquired a vapid, cow-like feeling called a negative state. I'm not sure how he knows how cows feel, but this is what he thought menopausal women experienced. Indeed, Wilson and his collaborators believed that these women exist rather than live. Now, Wilson did not, however, abandon women to their dreary fate. Indeed, he promised women a pharmaceutical escape route, estrogen replacement therapy. Comparing ERT to insulin, Wilson insisted that replacement therapy could both cure and prevent estrogen deficiency disease. By allowing women to, quote, remain fully sexed, long-term hormone therapy prevented, again, quote, the supreme tragedy of women's lives. So menopause is the supreme tragedy of women's lives. Now, the popular media, knowing a good story when they heard one, swiftly publicized Wilson's claim even before this. This is, while he's talking medical circles, popular magazines hop on board. By 1964, Time and Newsweek had published articles extolling the promise of hormone therapy to cure menopause, and women's magazines followed in 1965. The publicity intensified after the publication of Feminine Forever. The book itself sold more than 100,000 copies. When I started my menopause work in the 1990s, Feminine Forever was still in print. But it sold more than 100,000 copies in the first 7 months after its release. So this is crazy popular. And it was serialized. I mean, if it's not bad enough that you can get it at Barnes & Noble, bad enough. So it was also serialized in newspapers. So this is from the Wisconsin State Journal in 1966. Perhaps similarly, it was in Iowa and Michigan and California. So serialized in newspapers. And most important, it generated an interest in menopause reflected in a flood of popular articles and books. So this, again, is just some woman who had found this article and became, well, a proponent. So anyway, ERT, the pills to keep women young. She says in here that as a real woman, I died at menopause, but that ERT brought her back. All right, now Wilson's views, though echoing some others in the profession, did not represent medical orthodoxy. He just doesn't represent medical orthodoxy. Although long-term estrogen therapy did gain support during this period, physicians fell into one of four loosely defined camps. A small group of cautious physicians refused to use hormones under any circumstances. Another group prescribed hormone therapy for women with severe symptoms, like if you can't sleep through the night after night, because you have to get up in the middle of the night and change your bed because of hot sweats. These women were candidates for short-term estrogen therapy, but they denounced long-term treatment. Most of these physicians reserved hormone therapy to address symptoms most clearly linked to estrogen diminishment, vaginal atrophy, and hot flashes. Now, a third group did not advocate hormone therapy for all menopausal women, but recommended long-term estrogen therapy as needed. Although these physicians supported long-term therapy, they scrambled to distance themselves from the unreasonable expectations associated with it. They insisted that not all women required hormone treatments, but maintained that it provided miraculous relief for those women who did experience menopausal difficulties. And a fourth school of thought generally considered menopause a deficiency disease and therefore recommended hormone replacement at the first sign of estrogen deficiency, regardless of whether women exhibited any symptoms. Despite being quite radical, this long-term therapy for all women included several important gynecologists. And so between 1962 and 1975, no one position could represent medical orthodoxy. The popular messages, Wilson aside, about menopause and its treatment reflected the medical ambivalence. In general, the popular press portrayed menopause as a potential problem for women and promoted estrogen replacement therapy as its solution. Until 1975, virtually all of the articles depicted hormone replacement therapy positively, at least in the short term, focusing on the personal miracles ERT performed, and they do talk in that kind of miraculous language. In addition to assuring women that hormones could relieve hot flashes and vaginal dryness, popular health writers also claimed that hormones could prevent heart disease and osteoporosis. Okay. So as they did in an earlier era, popular writers also urged women to seek out the modern solution for menopausal troubles. In a 1967 Good Housekeeping article, a doctor compared estrogen treatment with glasses and hair color. If you couldn't read the fine print, you'd get glasses. And you've probably tried rinses for your hair. Take female hormones in the same way, a restoration of what used to be. The popular literature also raised, if only to dispel, the question of whether replacement hormones might cause cancer. Although the issue was clearly unresolved in the early 1970s, popular sources tended to dismiss the issue with glib reassurances. Wilson, in Feminine Forever, even suggested that HRT, estrogen plus progestin therapy, might even provide cancer insurance. But this is actually from a Massengill pamphlet. So clearly they want to, and Massengill sold drugs at the time. But so does estrogen cause cancer? I love the foot up, right? Only in mice. No, in fact, there is now some evidence suggesting a lower incidence of cancer in women taking estrogen. Only in mice have estrogens been found to cause cancer, and then only when given in massive doses. And then this is another, again, in an interview, a very important physician. Yes, it's definitely safe. There's absolutely no evidence by the experimental process that estrogens cause cancer of the uterus or breast in the human female. So lots of sort of glib reassurances. It's not a problem. Significantly, however, the popular literature did not generally maintain that all menopausal women would benefit from hormone replacement therapy. So they say, it's really great for the women who need it, but they don't then say, and everybody needs it. Instead, it emphasized that most women did not need estrogen therapy or any medical treatment. One article, for example, reminded its readers that the vast majority of gynecologists advise against the routine use of hormone therapy for all women. Although these articles then promoted estrogen therapy, they did not recommend long-term or even short-term treatment for all menopausal women. The popular literature also provided conflicting ideas about whether menopause was a disease. On the one hand, women could find support in popular magazines that menopause was, quote, a deficiency state which gradually defeminizes a woman physically. On the other hand, some articles challenged this assumption head on by insisting that menopause was a natural process that needed no cure. So given the disagreements within the information available to women, how can we understand the significance of this literature? How did this literature work? The popular literature did indeed publicize and promote estrogen replacement therapy as a wondrous cure for the negative consequences of menopause. Wilson's work and some other books and articles encouraged women to seek out long-term hormone therapy by dangling before women the consequences of untreated menopause and the modern miracles of hormone treatment. Although women could and probably did encounter this position while they thumbed through women's magazines, it did not represent the only view of menopause available during this period. Providing contrast to Wilson's outrageous rhetoric, the popular literature did not overwhelmingly present ERT as necessary or desirable for all women approaching middle age. Instead, it presented ERT as a valuable treatment for women experiencing a particularly difficult menopause. The wide-ranging opinions then allowed women to choose among several competing meanings of menopause and treatment regimens. Despite the lack of medical consensus, the use of estrogen therapy did indeed increase after 1962. Drug companies followed the free publicity gained by Wilson's efforts with their own advertising campaigns aimed at informing physicians of the wide-ranging benefits of hormone therapy. Further, some women, encouraged by the promise of relief from hot flashes or compelled by the image of a more youthful appearance, demanded hormones from their physicians. In time, most physicians acquiesced to pressure from both sides, drug companies and women, and from the desire to help their menopausal patients. Some doctors eventually saw hormone replacement therapy as a godsend for menopausal women, providing both long-term and short-term benefits with no apparent drawbacks. Other physicians prescribed hormones more reluctantly, giving in to their patients' demands while still believing that most women needed only an encouraging talk and a stiff upper lip to see them through the rough times. Regardless of the lingering doubts of some physicians, dollar sales of non-contraceptive estrogen more than quadrupled between 1962 and 1975. Similarly, between 65 and 74, the number of women receiving their first prescription for estrogen replacement therapy roughly doubled. They may only have received one prescription for it, but the number receiving their first doubled. In sheer numbers alone, then, medicine became a more prominent presence in the menopausal experience during this period. So between 1962 and 1975, physicians increasingly described menopause as a process deserving medical scrutiny and intervention. But again, it is easy to overstate the reach of this medical involvement. Although some physicians argued that menopause was a deficiency disease, most did not. Although some physicians urged the long-term use of hormones, most did not. Although more women than ever before sought and received medical advice and treatment for menopause, again, most did not. As a result, the medicalization of menopause did not rob patients or physicians of all their options. Medicalization, then, was hardly absolute. In 1975, at the height of estrogen's popularity, or the height until then, two 1975 articles in the New England Journal of Medicine dealt the therapy a significant blow. Researchers at Washington University and Kaiser Permanente Medical Center independently discovered a link between postmenopausal estrogen therapy and endometrial cancer. And I'm going to just go through the rest of this. We get a link to endometrial cancer in 1975, the first clear sign that estrogen therapy did in fact cause cancer. And as a result, the prescription of estrogen replacement therapy falls precipitously. So in 75, it's still at 28, and then after that, it falls precipitously. But you'll see hormone replacement therapy rises again fairly soon after that, in part because aging baby boomers just means there are more women who are menopausal in this time period. Women do still want relief from hot flashes, vaginal dryness, and other discomforts. Physicians also started adding progestin routinely to estrogen therapy. And if you add progestin, the cancer-causing element of the estrogen-only therapy goes away because the lining of the endometrium sheds with progestin. So it's much safer. So the replacement hormones do rise again. And also, the prevention of osteoporosis and heart disease emerged as primary indications for sustained hormone use. Although some medical researchers had championed estrogens to prevent these diseases for decades, only in the late 1970s for osteoporosis and in the 1990s for heart disease did they figure prominently in the marketing of hormone replacement therapy. By the early 1990s, something like a medical consensus emerged around the claim that long-term therapy was good medicine. Let me wrap it up. So what does the fall and rise of hormone replacement therapy tell us about the medicalization of menopause? Surely in the 1990s, more American women received a prescription for replacement hormones than ever before. Further, women increasingly use this therapy to prevent illness in addition to relieving symptoms. This latter development, however, complicates our understanding of the medicalization of menopause. The treatment that once helped gauge our level of medical involvement in menopause transformed into a generalized therapy for the consequences of female aging. Perhaps then that the medicalization of menopause did not intensify in the 80s and 90s. Instead, menopause provided a gateway for the medicalization of female middle age. But again, let us not lose sight of the roughly 66% of American women over 50 who, despite the hard sell by drug companies and the efforts of well-intentioned physicians, failed to embrace medical intervention. Certainly some of these women may have wanted hormones, but limited access thwarted their desires. Other women, perhaps influenced by the critique of medicalization or encouraged by a willingness to seek alternative healing paths, intentionally looked elsewhere for ways to cope. Some women found in soy products and black cohosh symptom reliefs. Others named hot flashes power surges and embraced them as a source of feminine inspiration. Still others gritted their teeth or bought a fan. And finally, some women barely noticed menopausal symptoms. At the apex of hormone replacement use then, women continued to seek out and employ alternatives to medical recommendations. Recent research, which is the Women's Health Initiative studies of 2002, call into question the future of hormone replacement therapy and the medicalization of menopause. But as we continue to track and analyze the medical involvement in the lives of women's lives, we must also gauge the reach of medical influence. Despite the increased medicalization of countless behaviors and bodily functions over the course of the 20th century, most menopausal women in the United States have not succumbed, at least not entirely, to medical dictates.